Listen. Before you speak, before you move, before you breathe too loudly, listen. There is a fear that is older than writing. Older than cities. Older than the first walls men built to keep the darkness out. It is a fear that lives somewhere deep in the human chest, below thought, below reason, in the place where instinct still rules. It is the fear of the dead who will not stay dead. Not the skeleton. Not the ghost. Something worse. Something that walks. Something that looks almost like the person you buried. Something that comes back, and it is hungry. Every civilization that has ever existed on this earth, from the frozen north to the burning south, from the first river valleys to the farthest islands, has told this story. They described it differently. They named it differently. But the core of the fear, the dead returning to consume the living, is the same. Every time. Everywhere. That is not a coincidence. That is something older than language trying to warn us. Tonight we go back to where it started. Not the novels. Not the films. Not the pale, handsome figure in the cape who seduces and charms. We go back further. Much further. Back to the clay tablets and the crumbling parchment. Back to the villages where people nailed shut their coffins and buried their dead face down in the earth so they could not find their way home. Back to the first recorded screams. This is the true origin of vampires. And it is far darker than anything Hollywood ever imagined. We must begin in Mesopotamia. Between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, in the land that gave birth to the first cities, the first laws, the first written languages, there also lived the first documented blood-drinking spirits. And they were not romantic. They were not beautiful. They were terror with a name. The ancient Sumerians, who built their cities of mud brick in the hot valleys of what is now Iraq, feared a particular class of spirit above almost all others. They called them the Giddim, the restless dead. The dead who had not been properly buried. The dead who had died violently or in childbirth, or by drowning, or who had been forgotten by their families. These spirits wandered the night, unable to find rest, unable to cross into the world below. And they were dangerous. But there were worse things than the Giddim. There was the Adimo. The Adimo was a spirit that attached itself to the living. It could not be seen, but it could be felt. It would press against a sleeping person and drain their life force. It was believed to spread disease. People who were wasting away, losing weight, growing pale, losing blood from unknown causes, were said to be victims of the Adimo. The spirit fed on them. Slowly. Over many nights. Until they died. Sound familiar? But even the Adimo was not the most feared. There was Lamashtu. Lamashtu was a demoness, the daughter of the sky god Anu, who had been cast out of heaven for her crimes. She was described in cuneiform texts, some of the oldest texts on earth, as a being with the head of a lion, the teeth of a donkey, the ears of a donkey, the hands and feet of a bird, and a body covered in bristling hair. She prowled the night, she entered homes without invitation, she attacked pregnant women and infants. She drank blood. She ate flesh. She brought plague. Tablets dating back to 2000 BCE describe rituals performed to drive her away. Amulets were worn. Incantations were spoken. Offerings were left at the door. The fear of Lamashtu was not superstition. It was recorded, codified, taken seriously by kings and priests and physicians. It was written in stone. And then there was Lilitu. The Lilitu, the ancient Akkadian spirit from which many scholars believe the later Lilith mythology grew, were a class of wind spirits who attacked men in the night. They were female. They were predatory. They visited sleepers, drained their vitality, and in some texts drank their blood. The Lilitu were associated with disease, madness, and the unexplained deaths of young men who had no visible illness. This is not mythology in the sense of fantasy. These were the medical explanations of the ancient world for diseases they could not yet understand. When a healthy young man wasted and died in a matter of weeks, when a pregnant woman lost her child, when a village was struck by plague, they looked for a cause. And the cause they named was often a spirit that drank life. Now move west. Move to ancient Greece. Greece, for all its philosophy and art, was also a land soaked in the fear of the hungry dead. The Greeks had several beings that fit what we now call the vampire archetype, and they described them with remarkable consistency over centuries of recorded history. The Lamia is one of the oldest. In early accounts, Lamia was a queen of Libya, beloved by Zeus. When Hera discovered Zeus's love for her, in her jealousy she killed all of Lamia's children. The grief drove Lamia mad. She became monstrous. She was said to wander the night, stealing children, drinking their blood, eating their flesh. Over time the myth evolved. Lamia became less a single cursed woman and more a class of being. Female spirits who appeared beautiful to lure young men, then fed on their blood and life force. Philosophers wrote about them. Poets described them. Horace, the Roman poet, warned his audience not to make his stories too fantastical, like a witch tearing up the insides of a child or Lamia swallowing children. The Impusa was another. The Impusa was a creature of the goddess Hecate, sent to frighten travelers. It appeared as a beautiful woman, seduced men, and then fed on their blood and flesh while they slept. Aristophanes mentioned the Impusa in his comedy The Frogs, written in 405 BCE. The creature was well known enough to be referenced as a joke, which means it was well known enough to be a genuine fear. There was also the Striges. The Striges were blood-drinking birds in early Greek belief, later evolving into women who could transform into birds. They attacked infants at night, draining them of blood. The Roman poet Ovid described them in his Fasti as large-headed birds with stiff wings and hooked beaks, who flew through the night seeking children to feed on. The Romans adopted this belief directly, and the Strix, singular of Striges, became part of Roman folklore, a night creature that killed infants by drinking their blood. In Rome itself, there are accounts of the Strix appearing in legal texts and public records, not just poetry. Roman law at certain points addressed the question of whether women who were believed to be Striges should be punished. The fear was embedded in the legal system. Move further east. Move to ancient China. The Chinese had a concept of a dangerous, restless dead that predates many Western accounts. The jiangshi, meaning stiff corpse or hopping corpse, was a reanimated body that fed on the living breath, the qi, of people it encountered. Some accounts describe it feeding on blood. The jiangshi was believed to result from improper burial, violent death, or a corpse being struck by lightning or jumped over by a cat. It moved rigidly with its arms stretched out before it, because rigor mortis had locked its joints. It was pale. It was cold. It left victims drained of vital energy. Records of jiangshi appear in Chinese texts from at least the Tang dynasty, from around the 7th century CE, though some scholars trace related concepts much earlier. These were not stories told to entertain. These were cautionary accounts, deeply embedded in Chinese beliefs about death, the soul, and the improper treatment of corpses. India had the Vetala, documented in Sanskrit literature dating back centuries. The Vetala was a spirit that inhabited and animated corpses. It lurked in charnel grounds, places where the dead were disposed of, and attached itself to human bodies, reanimating them. King Vikramaditya, one of the great legendary figures of ancient Indian literature, encounters the Vetala in a famous cycle of stories written down in ancient texts. The Vetala was not necessarily evil by nature but was dangerous, unpredictable, and inhabited the space between life and death. Malaysia and Indonesia had the Langsur, the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth, who returned as a vampire-like being to attack the living and drain their blood. The Langsur had long black hair, wore green robes, and had a hole in the back of her neck through which she sucked the blood of children. The ritual to prevent a woman from becoming a Langsur was documented in detail. Her mouth must be filled with glass beads, eggs placed under her armpits, needles in her palms. All of this was recorded practice, not legend. The Philippines had the Manananggal, a creature that could sever itself at the waist, with its upper body flying through the night on bat-like wings to feed on sleeping victims and prey on pregnant women. Spanish colonial missionaries who arrived in the Philippines in the 16th century documented their encounters with these beliefs, finding them deeply embedded in the culture. Africa is a vast continent with thousands of cultures and hundreds of documented traditions concerning the dangerous dead and blood-drinking beings. The Asambasam of the Ashanti people of West Africa was described in colonial-era accounts as a creature with iron teeth and iron hooks for feet, who sat in trees and snatched up travelers to drink their blood. Among the Hausa people, there are recorded traditions of witches and spirits who drain the life from others. In East Africa, various traditions describe spirits of the dead who must be appeased or they will return to harm the living, sometimes through consumption of vital essence or blood. The pattern repeats. Across continents. Across centuries. Across languages and religions and cultures that had no contact with one another. Something about the dead rising to consume the living is not a story any one people invented. It is something all of humanity independently feared. Now we come to the people who gave us the word itself. The word vampire, in its many spellings, Uper, Vampir, Wampir, comes from the Slavic languages. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, the lands we now call Serbia, Bulgaria, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and the surrounding territories, had one of the most developed and most terrifying vampire traditions in the world. And unlike many ancient myths, we have documented evidence of what ordinary people in these lands believed, feared, and did about it. The Slavic vampire was not beautiful. Let us be absolutely clear about that. It was not sophisticated. It was not an aristocrat in a castle. It was a neighbor. It was a relative. It was the man who lived 3 doors down who died last winter, and who people now said was seen walking in the lane at night. It was terrifying precisely because it was familiar. In Slavic belief, a person could become a vampire for several reasons. All of them were documented in folklore collected by scholars over centuries. A person who died suddenly and violently before their time might not accept death and could return. A person who had been excommunicated from the church, cut off from the protection of the community's spiritual practices, might return. A person over whose body a cat or other animal had jumped before burial might rise again. A person who had led an immoral life. A person who had died by suicide. A person who had been a witch or a sorcerer. In some traditions, being born with teeth already showing or with a caul, a membrane covering the face, was a sign that the child was fated to become a vampire after death. The Slavic vampire was called by many names depending on the region. In Bulgaria and Serbia, the word vampire appears in records from at least the 11th century. In Russia, the Upir appeared in chronicles from the 12th century. In Poland, the Upir. In Belarus, the Vupir. The variations are many, but the creature they describe is consistently recognizable. A dead body that has returned to prey on the living. What did the Slavic vampire do? First it came home. It returned to the people it knew in life. Its family, its neighbors, its community. This is one of the most chilling aspects of original Slavic vampire belief, and it is almost entirely absent from modern fiction. The vampire did not seek strangers. It sought the familiar. It came back to its own house. It sat at the table. It called out to its wife or children. In some accounts, it was said to lie beside its living spouse in the night. And as it returned, the people around it began to weaken. They grew pale. They lost appetite. They wasted. They died. The interpretation was clear. The dead thing was feeding on them. Not necessarily always by biting the neck. That particular method became popular later. In original Slavic belief, the vampire often fed on vital essence, on the energy of the living, simply through proximity. Its presence drained the life from those nearby. When several deaths occurred in one family over a short period, which was tragically common in pre-modern societies due to infectious disease, the explanation was often the first person who had died. They had returned. They were killing the others. The solution was to exhume the body of the first person who died and examine it. This is where the historical record becomes particularly vivid. When suspected vampire corpses were exhumed, witnesses reported, and these reports were documented by priests, local officials, and eventually by Imperial Austrian military physicians, that the bodies showed unusual characteristics. They had not decayed as expected. The skin was still supple. There was blood around the mouth. The limbs were flexible. The heart, when cut, still appeared to contain liquid blood. We know now, from modern forensic science, exactly why a body might present this way. Bloating, which occurs as gases build up during decomposition, can push blood up into the mouth and nostrils, creating the appearance of fresh blood at the lips. Decomposition is highly variable and depends on soil conditions, temperature, and other factors. A body buried in cold clay might indeed show little visible decay months after burial. The flexibility of limbs can persist for varying periods depending on conditions. But the people who opened those graves did not know this. They saw what they believed they saw. And what they saw was a monster. We come now to the cases that shook Europe. Not legend. Not folklore. Documented historical cases. Official investigations. Reports signed by military officers and physicians. Cases that were discussed in the courts of kings and in the newspapers of major European cities. The year is 1725. The location is Kisilova, a village in the Kingdom of Serbia, which at that time was under the administration of the Habsburg Empire of Austria. A man named Petar Blagojević had died. He had been a peasant. An ordinary man. He was buried and the village moved on. And then, according to the account submitted to the imperial authorities by the local provisor, the administrative official of the area, 9 people died in Kisilova within a very short time. 8 days. 9 deaths. In a small village this was catastrophic. Before they died, several of the victims reported the same thing. They said that Petar Blagojević had come to them in the night. He had appeared at the foot of their bed. He had grabbed them by the throat. He had pressed against them. And after his visit they had grown sick and weaker until they died. There was more. Petar Blagojevic's own widow came forward with a report that unsettled everyone. She said that her dead husband had come to their home after his burial. He had come back. He had asked her for his opansy, his shoes. She was so terrified by this that she fled the village entirely and did not return. One of Blagojević's sons also reported that his dead father had appeared to him and demanded food. The son refused. He was found dead shortly afterward. The village demanded action. They demanded that the body be exhumed and examined. The local priest, who was Eastern Orthodox, refused to participate without authorization from the patriarch. The villagers were beyond waiting. They threatened to leave the village entirely if something was not done. The imperial provisor, a man named Frumbald, agreed to oversee the exhumation himself, as his official report states. The body of Petar Blagojević was dug up. What they found, or what they reported finding, was described in detail by Frumbald in his official document, which was submitted to the imperial administration and has survived in historical archives. The body, which had been in the ground for roughly 10 weeks, showed the following: it had not decayed. The skin was fresh. The hair and nails had grown. The old skin of the face appeared to be peeling away, revealing new skin beneath. And there was blood at the mouth, fresh blood. The villagers did not hesitate. They drove a sharpened stake through the body. Blood reportedly gushed from the wound, and also from the ears and mouth. The body was then burned and the ashes were buried. The deaths in the village stopped. This account was not a rumor. It was an official Austrian imperial report, written by an Austrian official, describing what he had personally witnessed and what the villagers had reported to him. It was submitted to the Habsburg authorities and entered into the historical record. The report of Petar Blagojević is one of the earliest documented official vampire investigations in European history. But it was not the last. And the next case was even more dramatic. The year is 1726. 1 year after Blagojević. Another village in Serbian territory under Habsburg administration. A village called Medveda. A man named Arnold Paole, spelled Arnaud Paul in some documents, had been a soldier in the Habsburg military before returning to his village to farm. He was known in the village. People liked him. But it was also known that Arnold Paole had a secret trouble. He told people before his death that while he had been stationed near the town of Gosawa in Turkish Serbia, he had been tormented by a vampire. He had taken the traditional countermeasures. He had eaten soil from the vampire's grave and rubbed himself with the vampire's blood. In local belief, these acts could protect a victim and prevent them from becoming a vampire themselves. It did not work. Arnold Paole died from a fall from a hay wagon. He had not been sick. He had not wasted away. He died suddenly in an accident. And then, within about a month after his burial, 4 people in the village died. Before they died, they said Arnold Paole had visited them. The villagers took action. They exhumed the body 40 days after burial. What they found was recorded by military officials who were present. The body showed signs that the villagers recognized as those of a vampire. There was blood in the body. It had not fully decomposed. The official report, signed by several officers and surgeons, described the procedure. A stake was driven through the heart, the body allegedly groaned as this was done, blood poured out from the wound. The head was then cut off. The body was burned and the ashes were buried. 3 more bodies of individuals believed to be connected to Arnold Paole were exhumed and treated in the same way. The story did not end there. Several years later, in 1731, the same village of Medveda was struck again. 17 people died in 3 months. The villagers reported vampires again. This time, the Habsburg imperial administration sent an official military and medical investigation team. The team was led by a military doctor named Johann Fluckinger. Fluckinger and his team arrived in the village. They questioned the inhabitants. They examined the reported cases. They exhumed bodies. And then Fluckinger wrote a detailed official report called Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered, which was submitted to the Habsburg military command in Belgrade and eventually published. The Visum et Repertum is one of the most important documents in vampire history. It is not a folklore collection. It is an official military medical report. It describes, in clinical language, the exhumation of 17 bodies, the conditions of those bodies as the investigators found them, and the measures taken. It describes which bodies showed decomposition appropriate to their burial time, and which did not. Those that did not, those which appeared to show blood, unusual preservation or other anomalies, were designated as vampires and destroyed. The Visum et Repertum was published and circulated widely. It was read in the courts of Europe. It was discussed in newspapers. It sparked serious, formal debate among scholars, physicians, and theologians across the continent about whether vampires were real. That debate would last decades. We have spoken of Mesopotamia, of Greece, of the Slavic lands. But the dead who rise to consume the living appeared on every continent. The details differ. The shapes differ. The methods differ. But the fear at the heart of it is the same. Let us walk through these differences carefully because the differences matter. They tell us something about what each culture feared most and what they believed about death. The Slavic vampire, we have already met this creature in some detail. It was a reanimated corpse. It was bloated, ruddy in complexion, not pale, contrary to modern images. It could be recognized because when exhumed it showed signs of continued blood circulation and failed decay. It was primarily nocturnal. It fed on the living through proximity and sometimes through direct attack, pressing on the chest of sleepers, a phenomenon well documented in many cultures that relates to what we now understand as sleep paralysis. It targeted family first. It spread. Those it killed or drained could also become vampires after death, creating a chain of contagion that mirrored how epidemic disease moved through a community. The Greek Vrikolakas is closely related but distinct in several important ways. The Vrikolakas appears in Greek records from at least the 17th century, though related concepts are older. Like the Slavic vampire, it was a reanimated corpse. But the Greek tradition placed particular emphasis on the role of excommunication. A person who had been cut off from the Orthodox Church at the time of their death, denied the rites, the sacraments, the blessing of the community, could not be received by the earth. The earth rejected them, it was said. Their body would not decay. And so it walked. The Vrikolakas would walk to houses and knock on doors. This is a very specific detail, well documented in Greek accounts. It would call out to people. If someone answered the knock, they would be infected, would themselves begin to waste and die. The advice passed down through generations was never to answer a knock on the first call. Wait for the second. A Vrikolakas, it was said, would not knock twice. Only the living knocked twice. Think about that. Think about what it means that this rule was passed down through generations, that parents told it to children, that it was said as earnestly as any other piece of practical wisdom. Never answer the first knock. For generations people lived by this. The Romanian strigoi occupies its own distinct space. Romanian vampire belief is a rich and complex tradition with several layers. The strigoi could be either living or dead. The strigoi viu, the living strigoi, was a living person, usually a witch or one born with certain signs, who could leave their body at night and cause harm, drain life and spread plague. The strigoi mort, the dead strigoi, was the reanimated corpse version more familiar to vampire tradition. Romanian belief also distinguished between the strigoi and the moroi, another undead being, and the praecolasai, which was closer to a werewolf. The distinctions were specific and locally well understood. The strigoi was believed to leave its grave and visit family. It consumed their vitality. It had a particular appetite for cows and could drain animals as well as people. Cattle that were found dead without obvious cause or that stopped giving milk could be attributed to strigoi activity. Economic loss, the death of livestock, was as much a part of the vampire's threat as personal danger. The Romanian tradition of the strigoi also had particularly elaborate preventative measures we will examine in a later section, because Romanian communities had developed a highly specific ritualized response to the fear of vampires. This response included extraordinary burial practices, examinations of the body after burial, and if necessary the extraction and treatment of the heart. Now cross the world to China. The jiangshi, which we have mentioned in passing, deserves fuller examination. The jiangshi was a corpse reanimated through unusual circumstances: violent death, improper burial, a body struck by lightning, a body crossed over by a cat before burial. It was stiff because the animating force within it was not natural. It was an intrusion, not a continuation. It moved with both arms stretched forward. It could not turn its head because its neck was locked. It was pale to gray or greenish in color. It moved by hopping because its legs were stiff. The jiangshi fed on the qi, the life breath, of living creatures. It would approach a sleeping person and breathe in the qi that left their body during sleep. The victim would weaken. They would lose vitality. In some accounts, the jiangshi fed more directly, but the qi drinking is the earliest and most consistent description. The jiangshi was repelled by the sound of bells, by certain Chinese apotropaic symbols, and most famously by sticky rice, which was believed to absorb and neutralize its harmful energy. There is something that strikes the careful observer about all of these traditions. They are not, at their core, primarily about bloodthirst. The drinking of blood appears in many accounts, but what the creature in almost every culture primarily feeds on is life itself, vitality, breath, energy, the force that makes a body a living body rather than simply a physical object. The blood is the visible symbol of that force. But the fear underneath is the fear of something that consumes life. Before we go further, we must correct the image in your mind. Because the image you carry, the pale, elegant figure in evening clothes, with sharp fangs and a cape, who speaks in a smooth accent and never ages and turns into a bat, that image is not from folklore. Almost none of that is from folklore. That image was built piece by piece over the last 200 years, primarily through fiction and film. The real vampire, the one that terrified real people in real villages, looked nothing like that. In Slavic tradition, the vampire was ruddy, not pale. It was bloated. Decomposition gases cause a body to swell, and the body of an exhumed vampire was often described as fat, swollen, and red or purplish in color. It looked, in a terrible way, well-fed. In Bulgarian folklore, the newly risen vampire in its first stage was described as a shadow without bones, a translucent thing that needed time to solidify. Over time it became more substantial, more physical. It did not have elongated fangs in most traditions. In many Slavic accounts, the method of attack was not a bite to the neck at all. It was suffocation. The vampire sat on the chest of its victim. It pressed the breath out of them. This connects directly to the widespread historical phenomenon documented across many cultures as the night hag, the old hag, the Mara, the Alp, the experience of a heavy weight on the chest during sleep that produces a feeling of paralysis and terror. What we now understand as sleep paralysis was, for centuries, attributed to supernatural attack. The vampire did not necessarily avoid daylight in original Slavic folklore, though it was primarily a creature of night and darkness. The strict sunlight destroys vampires rule became fully developed in popular culture much later. In original tradition, the vampire was primarily associated with midnight, with liminal times, the hours at the boundary between one state and another. It did not transform into a bat. This detail has almost no presence in early Slavic folklore. Transformation into animals was more associated with witches and with the Slavic concept of the werewolf. The vampire-as-bat connection was strengthened by later fiction drawing on the real vampire bats of South America, which had been described by European explorers and naturalists. It was not immortal in the sense of being eternally conscious and ageless. It was undead, between life and death, locked in a terrible middle state, compelled by hunger and unable to rest. This is not the same thing at all as the vampire lord who has lived for centuries accumulating wisdom and power. The folklore vampire was less a predator by choice and more a tragedy, a dead person who could not stop. The folk vampire was recognized by specific signs during life and after death. During life, a person who ate excessively, who drank blood, who had a harelip, who had red or bluish hair, who was born with a caul, who was the seventh child in a family, who had died while unbaptized, all of these were markers in various traditions of someone who might become a vampire. After death, a body that did not decay at the expected rate, that showed blood at the mouth or nostrils, that appeared flexible when exhumed, that caused a series of deaths in the surrounding community. And one more important characteristic from Slavic folklore, the vampire was tied to its grave. It could wander but it had to return. It could not stray far from where it was buried. This is why the treatment of the grave was so important, and why the village had power over the vampire. If you could reach the grave you could act. The grave was both its home and its prison. Now we come to the arsenal. Not the one from movies, the real one. Some of what you know from film does trace back to genuine folklore. Some of it does not. Let us be precise. The stake through the heart is real. It appears in Slavic, Romanian, and Greek tradition. But the details differ from what cinema teaches. The stake was not always wood. In some traditions it was iron. In others it was hawthorn, a plant associated in many European cultures with boundaries and protection, a liminal plant that grew at the edges of fields and paths. In some accounts, the stake was not driven through the heart but through the stomach, or through the head, pinning the vampire to the earth of its grave and preventing it from rising. The reason for the stake in original belief was not to damage the heart as an organ. It was to nail the body down. To pin it. To anchor it to the earth so it could not get up. This is a crucial distinction. The vampire's power was in its ability to rise. Remove that ability and you remove the threat. But in many traditions, the stake alone was not considered sufficient. Decapitation was required. This is one of the most consistent elements across Slavic and Romanian traditions, and it appears in the documented historical cases we have already discussed. The head was separated from the body and often placed between the legs or beneath the body, so that even if the creature somehow rose, it could not find its head and would be disoriented and helpless. Fire was considered the most absolute solution. If a body was burned completely and the ashes were then scattered, ideally in running water or at a crossroads or some other liminal location, the vampire could not return. Fire appears in the Blagojević case in many Serbian and Bulgarian accounts, and in countless pieces of folk tradition. It was the final resort, the most certain method. Garlic is real. But again, the details matter. In Slavic and Romanian tradition, garlic was primarily a protective agent, not a weapon. It was placed around the doors and windows of homes to prevent the vampire from entering. It was rubbed on the foreheads of cattle to protect them. It was eaten by the living for protection. In some accounts, when a suspected vampire was exhumed, garlic was placed in the grave or stuffed in the body's mouth. The association of vampires with garlic is genuine folklore. But the dramatic recoiling, the terror, the burning, that comes more from later dramatizations. Running water was widely believed in many European traditions to be something that vampires, witches and many evil spirits could not cross or had great difficulty crossing. This belief appears in records across Slavic, German, English and Scottish traditions. The exact mechanism was never uniform. Sometimes it was because running water was considered purified, sometimes because it was associated with the boundary between worlds, sometimes simply because of the power of flowing natural things. In several folklore accounts, a vampire's ashes were specifically thrown into running water to ensure the creature could not reconstitute itself. The crossroads appears repeatedly as a significant location. Burying problematic corpses, suicides, criminals, those feared to be potential vampires, at crossroads was practiced in many European cultures. The crossroads was a liminal space, a place of decision and boundary, and the confusion of directions was believed to disorient a spirit and prevent it from finding its way home. Burial practices were themselves a form of defense. In various traditions, corpses suspected of being at risk of vampirism were buried face down, so that if they tried to claw their way out of the grave they would dig downward instead of up. In others the hands were bound. Poppy seeds, millet or grains were sometimes scattered in the grave, because the vampire was believed to be compelled to count every grain before it could leave, and counting so many tiny seeds would occupy it until dawn when it must return. Needles were driven into the body. Thorns were placed in the coffin. Coins were placed in the mouth, though this had mixed origins and meanings across cultures. The Eastern Orthodox Church played a significant role in vampire belief and in anti-vampire practice, particularly in Greek and Slavic traditions. The Church's teaching that a body properly blessed and buried in sanctified ground would be received by the earth and would decay naturally created the corollary belief that a body that did not decay had been rejected by God, rejected by the earth, and therefore dangerous. The involvement of a priest in the examination and treatment of a suspected vampire was considered essential in many communities. Exorcism prayers, the sprinkling of holy water, the placing of the host in the coffin. These were all documented responses to vampire threats. It is worth noting that some of the characteristics we associate with vampires, the cross burning their flesh, the inability to enter a home without invitation, the reflection in mirrors, have varying and sometimes quite late origins. The inability to enter without an invitation has some roots in the folklore idea that vampires were bound to their own territory and needed to be called in some sense to enter new spaces, but the formal rule as we know it today was substantially developed through literary tradition. The lack of reflection traces more clearly to literary sources, particularly late 19th century fiction. We will come to that. By the early 18th century, Eastern Europe had been producing official vampire reports for decades. The Blagojević and Paole cases were not isolated. They were the most famous of a pattern of exhumations, investigations and official actions that stretched across Habsburg-administered Serbia, Transylvania, Moravia, Silesia, and Poland. The vampire panic of the 1720s and 1730s was real. It was regional. And it spread. Part of the reason it spread was the nature of the Habsburg Empire itself. The empire administered vast territories with diverse populations and reported everything to a central authority. Local vampire panics generated official reports. Official reports were sent to Vienna. Vienna had to respond to them, which meant taking them seriously enough to issue instructions, send investigators, and in some cases publish official conclusions. The publication of Fluckinger's Visum et Repertum in 1732 brought vampire cases to the attention of educated Europeans who had previously only encountered them as vague folklore. Letters and treatises on vampires appeared across Europe through the 1730s and 1740s. Physicians debated the medical explanations. Theologians argued about whether the Church should take an official position. The French scholar Dom Augustin Calmet published a monumental work in 1746 called Traits sur les apparitions d'esprits, et sur les vampires ou les revenants, a treatise on apparitions of spirits and vampires or revenants, in which he collected and analyzed vampire cases from across Europe with serious scholarly methodology. Calmet was not credulous. He examined the evidence carefully and concluded with caution. But the very fact that he wrote such a treatise and that it was widely read, demonstrates that vampires had become a serious subject of intellectual discourse across the continent. The philosopher Voltaire was sardonic about the whole affair. He noted in his philosophical dictionary that while the 18th century prided itself on reason and enlightenment, France was also seeing solemn debates about whether vampires were real. He used the vampire panic to satirize religious and intellectual excess. But the stories had taken root. And then something important happened. The stories began to change. The rural peasant tradition, the bloated, ruddy corpse that returned to its village to prey on its family, began slowly to be refined by educated writers who found something compelling in the vampire's nature. Not just horror. Something darker and more interesting. The idea of a creature that lived by consuming life, that was immortal, that moved between the worlds of the living and the dead, that possessed an unsettling charisma. This was more interesting to literary minds than a decomposing body that needed to be pinned down with a stake. The transformation happened through a series of important literary moments. In 1819, John Polidori, a physician who had been the personal doctor of the poet Lord Byron, and who had been present at the famous gathering in Switzerland in 1816 where Mary Shelley also began writing Frankenstein, published a short story called The Vampire. Polidori's vampire, named Lord Ruthven, was not a peasant corpse from a Balkan grave. He was a sophisticated, aristocratic English gentleman who traveled in high society, seduced women, and left a trail of death in his wake. He was recognizably modeled on Byron himself, dark, charismatic, morally corrupt, irresistible. The Vampire was an enormous success. It was read across Europe. It was translated. It was adapted for the stage. It introduced to the cultural imagination the idea of the vampire as an elegant, upper-class predator. Someone who moved among the finest levels of society while secretly consuming it. This vampire was a revolution. It was barely connected to the Slavic tradition from which the word itself came. But it was compelling in ways the folklore creature was not. The folklore vampire was frightening because it was familiar. This literary vampire was frightening because it was glamorous, and glamour itself was revealed as dangerous. From Polidori, the literary tradition continued to develop. Various vampire stories appeared through the early and middle 19th century, each adding elements, refining the image, building toward a creature that was part folklore, part literary invention, part cultural anxiety. And then in 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. Stoker was an Irish theatre manager who had spent years researching his book. His research notes survive and have been studied carefully by scholars. He read accounts of Eastern European vampire folklore. He read the vampire literature that had accumulated since Polidori. He also encountered, through a book called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson, a brief reference to a historical Romanian ruler, a prince known in Romanian history as Vlad the Impaler, whose name meant son of the dragon or in some interpretations son of the devil. Dracula. Stoker took the name. Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III of Wallachia, who ruled in the 15th century, was a brutal military ruler who was famous for his practice of impaling his enemies on stakes. His cruelty was well documented. He was also a Christian prince who fought against the Ottoman Empire, and in Romanian historical memory he is a complicated figure, regarded by some with a measure of national pride. He was not believed by his contemporaries to be a vampire. He was not associated with vampires in Romanian folklore until after Stoker's novel made the connection. Stoker chose the name Dracula for its sinister sound and the brief historical reference he had encountered. He set the novel in Transylvania, a real region in what is now Romania, which added an air of authentic Eastern European mystery. But Count Dracula, as Stoker created him, was essentially the literary vampire of Polidori and his successors taken to its full, sophisticated expression. A creature of extraordinary age, power, and intellect, who could move through human society, who could transform into animals, who was destroyed by sunlight, in some interpretations. The exact nature of sunlight's effect in Stoker's novel is actually more ambiguous than cinema later presented it, and who was opposed by modern science, faith, and collective human effort. Stoker synthesized. He took elements from folklore, the stake, garlic, the inability to enter without invitation in some form, the connection to transformation, the Eastern European setting. He took elements from the literary tradition, the aristocratic bearing, the seductive threat, the ancient evil in modern clothes. He added his own inventions and the inventions of his immediate predecessors. And he created something that changed the vampire forever. After Dracula, the vampire was no longer primarily a folk belief. It was a cultural icon. And once it became an icon, it began to multiply. The vampire has survived. Not in graveyards, though that is where it lives in story. It has survived in us. In what we imagine. In what we fear. In what, perhaps strangest of all, we find ourselves drawn to. In the 20th century, the vampire moved from literature to film, and from film into something that saturates contemporary culture. Each generation has reformed it in its own image. The silent horror films of the 1920s gave us Nosferatu, a creature closer to the original folklore than to the romantic ideal, rat-faced and taloned and deeply wrong. The golden age of Hollywood gave us elegant, velvet-voiced creatures of the night who were terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Later decades gave us the vampire as tragic hero, as metaphor, as rebel, as lover, as something the audience roots for rather than fears. Something has reversed. The creature that was once the thing you called on God to protect you from is now something people want to be. This transformation is not random. It reflects something about the human relationship with death and with power. The vampire, in its original form, represented what the living feared from the dead: return, consumption, the refusal of death to stay in its place. But the vampire also represented something that some part of the human mind secretly desired: the refusal to die. The persistence beyond the body's natural end. The immortality that no religion has ever fully made believable enough to satisfy the deep animal terror of non-existence. The vampire cheated death. And we are fascinated by anything that cheats death. The scholars who study vampire folklore seriously, and there are many of them working in fields that cross anthropology, history, medical history, folklore studies, and psychology, have identified several distinct functions that vampire beliefs served in pre-modern communities. First, the vampire explained epidemic disease. When plague or fever moved through a village, killing one family member after another, the pattern looked like transmission from a source. The first person who died was the obvious candidate. They were the one who had started it. They were the one coming back and continuing to take victims. We know now that infectious disease spreads through pathogens, through bacteria and viruses, and that the first person to die was most likely the first person to be exposed, the accidental source. But without germ theory, without microscopes, without epidemiology, the interpretation that the dead were causing the deaths of the living was not irrational. It was the best available explanation for a visible pattern. Second, the vampire explained the grief of the bereaved. A person who had lost a spouse, a parent, a child experienced very real physical symptoms. Poor sleep, loss of appetite, weight loss, physical weakness. The wasting of grief can look very much like the wasting of illness. In a culture where it was believed that the dead could return to be near those they loved, it was a natural and in some ways compassionate interpretation. The dead person loves their family so much they cannot leave. They return. And their return, however inadvertently, costs the living their health. Third, the vampire managed the community's fear of the outsider and the transgressor. In many traditions, the people most likely to become vampires after death were those who had violated community norms. Those who had been excommunicated, who had committed suicide, who had been criminals, who had been witches. The vampire was not just undead. It was the consequence of deviance. It reinforced the rules of the community by demonstrating that breaking those rules had terrible consequences, not just for the individual but for everyone around them. Fourth, the vampire made death comprehensible. Modern secular cultures tend to see death as an end, a biological cessation that we have enormous difficulty confronting emotionally. Pre-modern cultures generally viewed death as a transition, as a passage from one state to another. The vampire was a failed transition. Something had gone wrong. The dead person had gotten stuck. And there was something almost merciful in the belief that the community could help unstick them, that the exhumation and the stake and the burning were not just protection for the living but also, in a sense, liberation for the dead. These functions were real. The beliefs that produced them were sincere. The people who drove stakes through exhumed bodies in 18th century Serbia were not stupid or primitive. They were doing the best they could with what they knew, responding with available tools to a genuine and terrifying problem. People were dying and they did not know why. We have germ theory now. We have epidemiology. We have forensic science. We know what a body does after death under various conditions. We know why the chest seems to collapse, why there can be blood at the mouth, why certain bodies decompose faster or slower than others. We know about sleep paralysis. We know about the psychology of grief. We have answers. And yet, the stories remain. The stories spread. The vampire has outlasted every rational explanation offered for it. It has outlasted the fears that created it. It walks forward into every new century it encounters and finds something new to consume. There is a reason for this. The vampire, underneath all the folklore in the film and the fiction, is a story about the most fundamental human fear. Not just the fear of death. The fear of what death takes from you. The fear that those you love will leave and will not return. The fear that the line between the living and the dead is not as solid as it appears. The fear that something is watching you in the dark and that your fire, however bright, cannot keep everything out forever. That fear is not a product of pre-scientific ignorance. That fear is in every one of us right now in this moment. It is the reason we flinch when we hear an unexpected sound at night. It is the reason we still, even now, even knowing what we know, sleep with something between us and the dark. We began with a question. Not spoken. Felt. The question that lives in the oldest part of the human mind, the part that still listens for sounds in the dark, the part that flinches at shadows. What if the dead come back? Across 6,000 years of recorded human history, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the printed newspapers of 18th century Vienna, from the shamans of Central Asia to the village priests of Serbia, from the philosophers of Athens to the peasants of Bulgaria, this question has been asked. This fear has been felt. These defenses have been built. These bodies have been exhumed. The vampire is not a story that anyone invented. It is a story that all of humanity arrived at independently, across every geography and every century. The details changed. The name changed. The face changed. But the thing underneath, the dead that will not stay dead, the hungry dark thing that returns to consume life, that never changed. The ancient Sumerians feared the Adimu pressing against sleepers in the night. The ancient Greeks feared the Lamia that wore a beautiful face to lure victims. The women of medieval Slavic villages feared the knock at the door that came once in the deep of night. The Habsburg soldiers who signed their names to reports of exhumed bodies knew something was wrong, even if they did not have the language for what that something was.